So good midday, everyone, and thank you for coming out for pizza. Thanks to Dr. Nearing for providing us with nutrition, but also thank you to President Savaldi, who, against there was ambiguity, determined that we should do something at Adams State University, an Hispanic serving institution, an institution that exists to provide opportunity to underserved people, that we should take some time out to commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a pivotal figure in the movement for African American civil rights in the 1950s and 60s, and for allowing me an opportunity over the years to shift my academic attention away from the 19th century into the 20th century, and it continues to be a good run. So welcome to this year's MLK Noonday Talk. I want to remind you that tomorrow at 7 p.m., Dr. Gwendolyn Zohara Simmons, she likes to be called Zohara, but Dr. Simmons, who was a Memphis native, longtime member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a survivor of Freedom Summer, the program that Bob Moses, who was here last year, that Bob Moses arranged in Mississippi to try to call attention to the problem of voting rights in Mississippi. And Dr. Simmons, who's now a professor of religion at the University of Florida, and an expert on the relationship between Sharia law and the condition of women. She will be here tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. in the Student Union building. And so it's a great opportunity that we've had over the last few years, not just to listen to academics, but to get to engage with participants in this vitally important, and I want to suggest ongoing movement for inclusion and for equality and for decency. That was a phrase that Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer used. She said, "We just want to live as decent people." And growing up in a part of the world that was passionately committed to denying some people even that most basic right, we're reminded of how important it is for all of us to continue the work so that we have humanity and decency and inclusion and different kinds of ideas that we could use to define equality. When I ask people about the United States Civil War, most people can tell me something about President Lincoln, and they can probably mention the battle at Gettysburg, and then it goes away from there. If you ask a person about the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, particularly if you ask specifically about African Americans, most people can identify Martin Luther King, and when pressed, they can identify what has come down to us as the I Have a Dream speech of August 28, 1963, as part of the March for Jobs and Justice on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Most people can do this. And so I thought this was a good touchstone as we are now 50 years away from the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and 50 years away come March of Bloody Sunday at the Edmund J. Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And we just had a blockbuster movie out about Dr. King. It made sense, perhaps, to talk a little bit about the dream. But most of us in higher education who have the unbelievable luxury, the unbelievable privilege of being able to pay attention beyond our own immediate survival needs, also remember this past year, 2014. It was Voltaire who said, "Le plus ça change, le plus même chose." The more things change, the more they remain the same. And we have lived through a year. But last year was not a good year. If you care about justice and you care about equality, if you even define equality as equal treatment before the law, it was a painful year. And we know it's painful because the prevaricators had to go into overtime to explain why we should assume that this is okay. And so it seems like maybe a good time to take stock of the dream articulated by Dr. King in 1963 and where we are in 2015. Mr. President, did we think we would last this long? Yeah. So this is my job. I'm a historian. I'm stuck in the past. I think we need to take some stock on where things have been and where we are today. Because now we're at a lot of 50 and 60-year commemorations. Bob Moses, who we were so honored to host here last year, turns 80 years old on Friday. 80 years old. And so many of the movement veterans who survived the movement have gone on. Dr. King, born in 1929, and so born at a time that scholars call this the nadir of Jim Crow. In the ugly, sordid, despicable history of race in the United States, this is the period when it was the worst. I mean, it's just a horrible thing to imagine what it would be like to be African American and live in the 19-teens or 20s. And yet Dr. King, of course, is very fortunate. He's part of the African American elite in Atlanta, Georgia, where he's born. He was born Michael Lewis King. And I want to tell you, to illustrate the privileged background as a black person that he enjoyed, how does he come to be Martin Luther King? His father, Daddy King, went to the University of Heidelberg to continue his ministerial studies, right? One of the eminent seminaries in Germany, where he became so captivated by the courageous story of Martin Luther, a man in his own day who took on a challenging and total system and said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He was so impressed that he came back and legally changed his son's name to honor the great religious leader Martin Luther. We would likely never have heard of Dr. King but for the contingency of history. That is, history, a lot like evolutionary theory, posits the notion that if we ran the tape again, things would turn out differently. It was an odd coincidence that even created the Dr. King that comes down to us through both history and memory. And that was, Dr. King was a brand new minister finishing his PhD when he got a very comfortable pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. This was the church of the elite in the African American community, the faculties at Alabama State University, the superintendent of the segregated school system in Montgomery. They're members of Ebenezer. It is not the place that you look for people who will rock the boat. And yet events happened. And an NAACP field secretary who worked as a seamstress down in downtown Montgomery had simply had enough. She had had it with a bus driver. They'd had altercations in the past. And let me help you, she not only didn't just refuse to give up her seat, she actually moved from the aisle seat to the window seat, which is a nice way of saying, if you need to have an incident, right, let's do it now. And it was the women of Montgomery. It was faculty members at Alabama State University figuring out how not to use any state supplies so that because there'd be white retribution, who arranged for a one-day boycott following the arrest of Rosa Parks in 1955. And then that boycott was extended as the men took over, which is a huge part of the very complex story of the past. And because he hadn't had time to offend anyone in the ministerial community, in the community of the NAACP, and the community of the activist movement there in Montgomery, it was Dr. King that was chosen because of who he wasn't. to be the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and to become the spearhead of the civil rights, at least one important part of the civil rights movement. It's often amazing what happens when we pick people. We don't always know what we're going to get. And this time, we got something truly exceptional. And Dr. King, largely through the aegis of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference formed in 1957, arose to national prominence as one of the spokespersons of a movement for African American equality. He gives the famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize, the first African American to do so in 1964. Because of King's activism, because of the activity by the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, because of a number of things, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. It is an attempt to try to use the power of the state to compel fundamental decency. It simply said, among other things, that you could not deprive people of services at hotels and restaurants simply because they were black. I love this story. To see that the bill did not pass, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia introduced the word sex, he meant by that what we mean by gender, into the bill, figuring if he made it also about women, the Senate wouldn't vote for it. That led to Title IX, right? Thank you, Senator Byrd, I appreciate that. If you saw the movie Selma, if you have a historical consciousness, you can visit this place today, and it's an eerie kind of a place to visit. But African Americans trying to demonstrate for federal voting rights legislation attempted to march the 80 miles from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, down U.S. Highway 80, which today is named the Walter Gavan Parkway. He was the leader of the Alabama White Citizens Council. I'm sure that was an accident. But they're met by Al Mingo and the Alabama Department of Public Safety and beaten into bloody pulps by, wait, the Department of Public Safety. Franz Kafka and George Orwell were so naive if they had only had a U.S. context to think about. But in the wake of Bloody Sunday, of course, Lyndon Johnson would ultimately sign the Voting Rights Act into law in August 1965, an act that recently, in another Alabama case, Shelby v. Holder, was virtually gutted by the United States Supreme Court. And then, of course, Dr. King himself was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4th, 1968. A horrific event. And you know, it was interesting what people said at the time. You know, it's white people that lost their best friend, right? Because the only person left that could talk across the deepening color line had been assassinated. And of course, if you think about this, the only white politician, you remember this day, Robert Francis Kennedy, was assassinated in June. 1968 was a really, really, really bad year. We have years sometimes that stand out like that. But what about this dream? And this, if you remember a couple of years ago when Dr. Charles Payne was here from the University of Chicago, and Dr. Payne talked about how as a person in Afro-American studies who was a generation younger than King, he thought of King as this sort of irrelevant uncle, this sort of crazy older black guy that people liked, but the younger people didn't take him seriously. But he said something, he said a couple of powerful things. Like he could not understand why he was so angered when he learned that King had been assassinated by a white man, even though his own views about civil rights maybe required different tactics to achieve. But he also said something that I think is very powerful about our image of Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech. He said, and this is a quote, "Vapid, ellipsis points, devoid of organizing principles and ideas." And that's because the speech is really like a pep talk, right? So it wasn't meant to be a treatise, but it plays a trick on us today when we read it, as we're looking for a set of prescriptions. When the idea was, from the challenging perspective of 1963, he still believed that things could get better in the future. I mean, if there's an organizing principle, it's that, but that is implicit, not explicit. It's implied and not stated. And so he talks about lots of things here, of equality and human brotherhood. And oh my gosh, even, I love this, I'm from Mississippi. We get a lot of well-deserved bad ink from, I've spent a long time apologizing from where I'm from because there's so much to apologize. This was true. Sweltering with the heat of injustice, heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. But this is an idea about the future as opposed to the prescription for the present. And then this is a funny thing. Every movement, including the Ku Klux Klan, has borrowed this line. Because in the end, we want it to be about individuals. We really do. And I'll tell you that there are probably a lot of good arguments for individualism. But let me tell you the bad side of individualism. It absolves those of us in the majority of any collective responsibility. And so I wonder about the ideas that we choose to embody. We certainly embody ideas that privilege ourselves and make ourselves feel better about who we are. And we sometimes eschew ideas that might cause us to be honest or cause us to have to accept a little more responsibility for the way things are. So we want to live in a world where people, according to Dr. King, are judged by what they do as opposed by who they're constructed to be by society. And that's a very defensible idea at some level. That's a defensible idea. It's a noble idea. If it wasn't noble, Dr. King wouldn't have said it. But then we have this problem, right? We have the problem of measuring whether or not we're making progress toward an idea where people's behavior and how they are acknowledged and accorded benefits in society are somehow congruent. And it's been this way for a long time. There almost wasn't a Martin Luther King commemoration, in part because a lot of people said Dr. King would not have wanted this. He actually says this in his one of his final speeches where he talks about being a drum major for justice. He said, just give me this little marker and I'll be fine. So there were people that said, well, we don't want the holiday. Of course, there are other people who don't want a King holiday because they don't want a holiday for a black person. Now, they mask this and they say, well, all the other holidays that we have were for important public figures like Lincoln and President Washington, right? And so, we can't honor a person, right, who wasn't a president. Well, you think about that, it seems like a neutral principle, but there's no way, right, before Smith v. Allwright in 1944, the black person was ever going to be a candidate for anything. And before black people could vote, you're not going to have black presidents. So it's a neutral principle that's articulated to support a racist position. I know that never happens very often in the world. But we got the King holiday in part, I love this story, because holidays, back when we had labor unions negotiate for holidays. And so this became kind of a bargaining tool. Well, we want the 4th of July, and we want Labor Day, right? And by the way, Columbus Day, I know he was president, right? President Spalding, he was, never confused. He was a confused Italian. He thought he knew where he was. And it was funny that all the way through the negotiations, as it was clear that a bill was going to come from Congress, creating a King holiday, President Reagan said he wasn't going to sign it. And of course, why wasn't he going to sign it? Well, his party is trying to court the white power structure, particularly from states like Arizona, which is like Mississippi in the West, and then the old Confederacy. And the white people certainly don't want to honor King. And so Reagan says, I'm not going to sign it. He reluctantly signs it. I have never been able to identify for sure, did Peggy Noonan write this or not? Because she's reticent about this. But this is an interesting thing. In some ways, this is an incredibly powerful statement. But it's a statement that causes a problem of measurement. So one of the problems with the statement is that in 1983, it appears to treat the problems of race and inequality, those aspects of King's dream, as something that's been taken care of. We had a problem, we took care of it, it's over. And then, oh yeah, traces. It's a powerful word, right? Traces, right? And so then this is an interesting thing. Public holiday, right? We took action collectively, but the future, it's all up to us as individuals just to treat each other better. It's an amazing statement. And so the problem is we're often seduced by the statement sometimes to think that things are different than the way that they are, because we want race to be exceptional rather than in the marrow of the U.S. Body politic. We want things to be better in the present than maybe they are. And we're often befuddled at trying to figure out what to do about them. I want to kind of create a little bit of confusion here because we have a lot of data that can be read a lot of different ways. This is some really, really bad stuff, right? Only South Africa in history rivals the United States for the number, the percentage of people we put in prison. We criminalize everything, right? We criminalize everything unless you mismanage a retirement fund, right? That's not a criminal act. But we criminalize lots of other things. We really do. But here's an interesting thing. African Americans must really be a special criminals, or there's something really offensive about this. So if this is okay, then either African Americans have an innate criminal tendency or we have a collective problem, right? That's how it is. This is amazing. 1 in 6 currently in prison. 1 in 3 can look forward to jail time. And let me help you with jail time. Not only do you lose that time, you often go into jail and you accrue costs that you have to pay back. And then imagine being a black person and saying, hello, doctor, I felt I'm here to apply for a job. I'm an African American male and I've got a prison record. Good luck with that. And so prison is bad for everybody. It's a hard thing, right? But when people are overrepresented in prison, it has a huge effect on African American communities. And so we talk about, oh, the plight of the African American single mom. And the idea is, well, she must be promiscuous. No, her partner's in jail. Chances are for existing while black. It's a tough issue, right? This is an amazing thing. African Americans, right? A higher percentage of African Americans who were eligible to vote voted in the 2012 presidential election than white Americans. And when you think about what that figure would have looked like in 1964, this is a positive thing. On the other hand, I wonder why this figure is so low, right? So you know your guy ain't gonna win, so you ain't gonna turn out to vote for, you got that. So it cuts in a lot of directions. This is a huge change, right? A huge change. And the Joint Center of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., they track this stuff. You can be up to the minute from their website. But let me talk about this one a little bit. When we look at, say, a state like Mississippi, Amazing, Mississippi always comes up. 40% of the electorate there is African American. They have 6 congressmen. One, Benny Thompson, graduate of Tougaloo College, an activist in the 1960s, one African American congressman. Most of the African American voters are in his district. And you say, well, they can move. No, no, no. Voting districts are drawn by people. And so we draw a line around all the black people, right? And they get their 1 representatives. And so when you think about this, what this means is white Mississippians, by virtue of racism, are overrepresented. If you're a white in Mississippi, your vote counts more in Mississippi than it should, right? Because we draw districts to maximize your political influence. In the 1930s and 40s, and all the way down to 1959, when Alaska and Hawaii were admitted to the United States as states, the 17 states with legal segregation, 34 senators, veto-proof racist majority in the United States Senate. And oh my God, did they exercise their power. This is why Social Security did not extend to domestic help or agricultural workers. And they're so proud about that. And you go, well, wait, well, so who do you think the domestic help and the agricultural workers were? So keeping blacks out, keeping blacks down, maximizes white privilege, and the record is just overwhelming. It doesn't really admit another kind of interpretation. Just one of those things. This is huge. This is huge. But I want you to think about this, right? I want you to think about this. High school diploma, right? Here we are at Adams State University, right? What's the gateway now? So this is an achievement. It's a big dang deal. But if all you have is a high school diploma, maybe you're, just suggesting one of those things. A lot of ambiguity. I'm always struck by the fact, right, in 1966 and then in 2010, the poverty rate hasn't moved much, right? And the African American poverty rate has moved some, right? So what do you make of ambiguous data? Is the dream realized or not? Almost no movement here. Almost no movement here. And so, what about this dream? Yeah, had to go there. You recognize these folk? Now let's get, they're all dead. That much we know. These people are dead. Who's this guy? Trayvon Martin?
Brown? Michael Brown? Oh, that guy.
Eric Garner. This one breaks my heart. Tamir Rice. 3 black men, and they're dead. Okay? You know who these people are?
Oh, that's the eater shooter.
Okay, you better recognize this one.
9,000 jurors that got elected for that.
Right? Right? So this is our Aurora shooter. And this is Jared Lochner, right? The person that shot Gabby Giffords. Now let's just talk about the facts that we know, right? This guy is unarmed. This guy is unarmed. This guy was armed with a BB gun, and they're dead. And they killed exactly 0 people. This guy shot 18 people, killed 6. My father, he had a horrible sense of humor, would say, that's pretty good trigonometry, don't you think? Yeah. It's amazing I turned out as well as I did. This guy shot 70 people, killed a dozen. They're alive and well. Now let's see. These people killed nobody, and they're dead. These people killed people, and they're alive. Now there was police involvement in all 3 of these cases. In fact, that's why they're dead. And there was police involvement in these two cases. So here's my question. It must be the content of character at work, right? Because how do you explain the fact that these two people can commit mass murder and they're taken into custody? This guy can sell cigarettes and he's killed being taken into custody. And I could pick other examples. These just happen to be graphic, and I guess I enjoy getting hate mail from people. I get some periodically, some that I don't necessarily deserve. So I'm curious about this. So I got this from the NAACP Children's Defense Fund, a great organization headed by Marion Wright Edelman, who was a lawyer in the movement, and now, oh, guess what? Tries to help kids. Thanks to Dr. Novotny and Dr. Savaldi, I've had to adjust my professional attentions in ways. It's been a wonderful gift. I have to pay attention to kids. And the upside is I see heroic people. Forget first responders. I'm thinking about early childhood educators and teachers' aides and elementary school teachers, because that's the important arena. What we do in higher ed, we get to work with the winners, the succeeders, right? They have everybody, right? And these are people that are doing incredible work, and yet the deck is stacked against them. And so we have a term now, it's a depressing term, Dr. McNeil Smith. It's a depressing term that comes, we call it the cradle to prison pipeline. Now, if you've worked with small children, really? Why should they wind up in prison because of where they happen to be born? Look at this. 40% of students expelled from U.S. schools each year are black. Let me help you. The school population last year, and in schools, 15%. So African Americans must commit 2.5 times. But you know what I learned from some of my education colleagues? We misdiagnose a lot of behavior. And we do it with young men, Cameron. We do it with young men badly. And imagine if you're a young person of color. And so if you struggle with math, we put you in special ed. And if you act out, I love this. We have arrested 7-year-olds on school grounds under zero tolerance policies. Now, remember something that Earl Warren wrote in Brown versus Board of Education. He said, to generate such feelings of inferiority in a child because of their race creates damage that is unlikely ever to be undone. What does a 7-year-old know about the system? What does the 7-year-old... Self-esteem? I'm certainly not going to find it in school. So imagine you come back from prison, right? Because you're only 7. How are you ever going to be mainstreamed back into a pattern of achievement? Character? You're 7 years old. It's an amazing thing. African American and Latino students, twice as likely not to graduate as a card-carrying white person. I can tell you that it just doesn't take much to get through high school if all you're required to do is to do your work, right? If the rules were in place for me as a white person that operate the way that they operate for non-white people, I'd have never made it. Never have made it. So either African American and Latinos lack the intellectual capability, which not much is required, or something else is going on, right? Almost 70% of the males in prison, all races, don't even have a high school diploma, right? And so this is this is from the Children's Defense Fund that works in education. And this is an educational institution. You know, this is how education factors in. But if we look, the same thing is true away from school. So I wonder, how does a person wind up in foster care? What makes a home become dysfunctional? Well, let's see. 1 in 6 in prison. So we've got homes where daddy has no chance of ever maturing into a responsible parent because daddy's in jail. What does mama have to do? Well, we'll put them in foster care. And I know there's some great people that work in this system and they do incredible things, but the deck is stacked against people in foster care. You want a predictor? Here's the predictor. If you don't have a high school diploma, you're most likely to go to prison. If you're in foster care and you're male, you're most likely to go to prison. That is the most likely outcome that you have. And so, I feel, I do, Cameron, I feel badly for my students sometimes. Like, are we ever going to talk about anything good? And my response is, we would if I could just find something. But that's the problem with history. It not only does it, if it bleeds, does it lead? If it bleeds, it's the only thing we ever talk about. But in some sense, maybe that's all there is. So, one of the things that maybe we need to do with Dr. King's vision is give it some measurables. And you know why we don't? Because we don't want to be held accountable, right? If I give a measurement, right, I never want to have a one-loss record written into my contract, right? Because I don't know that I can win all the games, right? I don't want student performance written into my contract, right? So we often avoid accountability and we prefer the ethereal. We prefer the rhetorical because it makes us feel good. And besides, if you're in this room, I know you're not in prison. If you're in this room, chances are you have a high school diploma. If you're in this room, chances are you have a college diploma. Chances are you have a PhD. This is not going to affect you directly. And so we have the luxury of looking the other way, but I'm suggesting, and maybe we'll do this next time, if there is a next time, that if we don't do something, what will that look like? Right? So probably, I think this is also true. I got to give a prequel for this. I find that as I get older, this becomes harder. The more I learn, the more it hurts in some sense. But I had to explain in a video to a civil rights class, how to talk about change. And there is change. Let me tell you the story of James Craig Anderson. He is a black man who should not have died. He was run over by a man in a truck who was 19 years old, who was so happy that he's on the cell phone with his 9 hooligan friends who were there because it was part of they would go out looking for black people to terrorize. I done killed me a nigger. He is delighted to say that. All 10 are facing sentencing. They've all been tried and convicted under the Shepard-Garner Hate Crimes Act. Matthew Shepard and James Garner, the African-American, dragged to death in Texas. That would not have happened in 1950. Now, like most things, there's another side. Why? Oh, why? That's the LBJ moment. Was there a murder that had to be prosecuted? And this kind of murder. Where were the mamas and daddies? Where were the preachers? And where were the professors and the coaches who taught these young men that this would ever be okay? And the best the state can do? We lock them up. And I'll tell you how we do this. If the warden is African American, we're going to let people know why they're there. And that's a special kind of hell, right? Special kind of hell, being in prison for this kind of thing. Right? So you'll end up having to turn to a prison gang to stay alive. So it's a change, and it's an important change. But it's a change that also reminds us how much work ought to be done. I don't think that this is a rhetorical construction. I think this is an accurate label based on data. If you're born African American, especially if you're born African American male, if your parents don't have degrees from Howard University and MIT, it's going to be much harder for you. You see, the GI Bill took care of my father. And African Americans did not get to participate in the GI Bill the same way that my father So instead of being raised in poverty, my father had a master's degree in biology. Nothing is bigger than that fact in my own life. So if you don't have those advantages that were created by federal legislation, not by my father's initiative. He did have to go through boot camp. He did have to, right? But federal legislation created that opportunity. And it's policy at all levels that create this. Where did I get that word? Can somebody tell me why I use the word demonize? Demonize. To convince a jury that he had not used excessive force. Darren Wilkinson described Michael Brown. He said, he looked like a demon. Now let's unpack this. Whether you believe in demons or not, are demons natural or not natural? Right? So either you believe in them, but they're not part of nature. Or you're an academic and you say, well, yeah, this is a construction piece. So you can get yourself acquitted by saying that a Homo sapien who is African American can frighten you so much because they look like something that isn't even real, but it's terrifying. Terrifying. It was funny, not funny, it was not funny at all. What a terrible choice of words. When Eric Garner's, the grand jury decided not to indict the policeman, one of our few African-American students who was not an athlete. He came to my office and he said, I just got to talk to somebody. He was mad. You know what he was mad about? This was the slide I didn't put in. Stupid things that white people say even when they mean well. So you could probably understand why a black male might be really, really angry about an outcome. I've seen white males get really, really angry about a judicial outcome or even a football game. White cops acquitted are not going to be prosecuted in the death of a black man who committed the awful crime of selling unlicensed cigarettes. This is what the white persons were telling my student. You need to get over it, bro. It's not about race. Not everything's about race. I was going to use that story to make another point, but I thought better about it because we can't just scream and rant. We have to get better in how we think about things. Why is it that when these things happen, black folk think it's got to be about race, and white folk think it's got to be something else? I don't have a full answer, Dr. Murphy, I don't. But I do know this much. I think I know this much. We have the luxury in the majority culture for things not to be about race. Almost never about race. And other people don't have that luxury. So maybe think about why something being about race might cause you discomfort as a white person, so you feel the need to say to a black person, it's not about race. I mean, we can't begin to work together effectively until we can get to the point that we can acknowledge that other people have perspectives that are painful. And maybe they just need us to shut up and listen. Right? You don't tell people how they should grieve for a lost loved one. Right? You learn that early on. Why would you tell a member of a racial group how they should think about racial grief? Why would we presume? And yet we think it's okay, or a lot of us do. And we do it. Sometimes we mean well. Stop doing it. That'd be a good thing. I want to thank Dr. Carol Guerrero Murphy and David Svaldi and Lillian Gomez and all the wonderful people that had brought Adams State University into the work of equity and to develop not only a vocabulary, but a vision. And it's an important vision, it's an important institutional vision, it's an important educational vision. This stuff never ends. It can get better, but it goes on forever. It's enduring, like the classics, like rhyming poetry. It endures. So we need to find a way to continue the work. And not just to say, well, you know, Dr. King was a great man, and he lived an important, inspiring life, and we passed some laws. That was important stuff in the 1960s, and the legacy is still important. We have work in 2015 that's just as pressing. And maybe what makes it hard is it's not quite as obvious as the Edmund Pettus Bridge or the assassination of Dr. King. So let's resolve to continue the work. So that's it. Thank you for enduring. If you have questions or comments, I'll take them. If not, there's some more pizza here. Okay, we're done.